Well, again, it's great to have you with us today. You know, it's almost mind-boggling to think that with modern technology, we can stream our Sabbath services live or delayed. We can archive our messages for on-demand viewing at any time, day or night, 24/7, 365 days a year. It's actually become relatively easy, and in some cases very inexpensive, for anyone to do this today. Of course, some of our younger viewers may not remember a time when there was no internet, or not even any radio or television. You know, when I was young, there was no internet. We had a television that could receive only 2 channels, and one of them was full of snow. Some of us might remember those days. The first commercial radio broadcast occurred actually on November 2nd, 1920. Radio broadcasts just go back to around 100 years ago. If we go back around 200 years, we really had no electronic communication whatsoever. But then came the telegraph and then the telephone. That was followed by radio and then television. But think about the ancient Israelites for a moment. Can we imagine trying to explain radio or television to them? Or better yet, the internet? You know, they communicated by shofars or trumpets, and in some cases, maybe by setting fires that could be seen from a distance. My, how times have changed. Not only have they changed, but unlike in the past, change is occurring very rapidly today. You know, for thousands of years, communication remained relatively unchanged. It's only in the last couple of hundred years that electronic communication has advanced at a blistering pace. Who knows what new technology might be next? Indeed, how times have changed. Automobiles, airplanes, air conditioning, computers. Even electrical power to our homes is actually a relatively new thing. As recently as 100 years ago, many rural areas still had no electricity. But all these wonderful technological changes have not all been positive. You know, when transportation became faster and more efficient, it seems the number of injuries and deaths increased as a result. With air-conditioned homes, people stopped sitting outside on their front porches in the summertime. We became more distant from our neighbors. Computers, tablets, and cell phones can also cause eye strain, as well as headaches and neck and shoulder pain. Sleep can also be affected. Now, most of the negative effects of modern technology can be avoided with moderation and maintaining proper posture and other good habits. But technology is not the only thing that has changed us as a society. There are other areas in our lives which have changed over time. And technology isn't always responsible for all these changes. Today, I'd like to look at how Christianity has changed. For the better in some cases, but also for the worse. But for modern Christianity in general, times have changed, literally, and we'll get to that. For those who lived in Jesus' day would be shocked to see our computers and cell phones of today. They'd be amazed at our air-conditioned vehicles and our system of roads. I'm sure that air travel would absolutely impress them. It just might take them a while to acclimate to today's society with all the changes in transportation and communication and etc. But what about Christianity? Would they see great improvement in Christianity today? What do you think? With modern communication, we no longer have to visit everyone in person to preach or teach the gospel of Jesus Christ. You know, radio and television have allowed us to reach millions of people at once. It's been going on for a while. And these two greatly increased the reach of ministries preaching the gospel. But of course now, the internet has an even greater reach. And for the first time in history, the internet allows even a single small ministry the ability to reach almost the entire world. Now, according to the website internetworldstats.com, they say, in 2022, the internet covers right at 70% of the world, and that figure continues to increase. I know we're small, but the Independent Church of God's Seventh Day is getting traffic from many different parts of the globe, actually. I checked our demographics earlier this week to see where it was coming from. Now, those in the United States by far spend the most time on our website. However, we have viewers from Canada. China was actually in third place for visits to our website this past week. They were followed by Germany, Sweden, Australia, France, and the UK. Only the top eight countries were identified in our report, but there are more. In Matthew 24, verse 14, Jesus tells us, "And the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." Well, if you're wondering about that, we're expecting to see 90% of the world connected by the internet by the year 2030. That's just over 7 years from now. At that point, practically the entire world can be reached by even a single ministry. While this might leave our fellowship issues still a bit of concern, our ability to teach the world about God's coming kingdom has drastically improved from the days when we had no other choice than to travel all over the world to share the gospel. So that's good. But what about the message itself? What would Jesus and his disciples think about the message that modern ministers preach and teach today? Well, Peter was obviously very close to Christ. And after receiving the Holy Spirit, I'd say Peter understood very well what it meant to be a disciple of Christ, or a Christian. You might always think about Peter when he preached that powerful sermon on the day of Pentecost. Remember that? I'll just read you Acts 2, verse 38. "Then Peter said to them, Repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit." So I always think about that, but imagine, if we can, that right after Peter's sermon on that day of Pentecost, that somehow he was instantly transported in time to be with us here in our time period. Let's say that Peter showed up in a typical Christian church on Easter Sunday and witnessed what the Christians of today are doing. So the question is, would Peter understand what was going on based on what he knew as a disciple of Christ when Christ was here? Well, he might ask questions like, why are all these children hunting for these Easter eggs? Or why are these rabbits all around here? Some of them are as big as a human. In fact, I'm seeing children that are even sitting on their laps talking to them. Well, that's kind of strange. It seems that people are assembling for a religious service, but this is not a weekly Sabbath day, nor is it a high Sabbath day that God declared. He may not understand. I'm sure Christmas would be confusion to Peter. Where did Santa Claus come from? And why do so many of his characteristics mimic those of Jesus Christ? And of course, what about his companions, the Krampus? Now, some of you may not be familiar with Santa's Krampus. If not, please look up the name Krampus. I think you'll be surprised. It's spelled, in case you're wondering, it's spelled Krampus. That's Krampus. Now, Christmas also never falls on one of God's holy days unless it's by coincidence. Now, on the other hand, Peter would likely show up at churches that would not be meeting on the Sabbath day, as he and the rest of the disciples and Jesus himself did. So I can see that Peter very well might say to himself, wow, how times have changed. He would likely find most churches empty on God's Sabbath days, and that's because times have changed. You might say our appointments with God have changed. Turn to Leviticus 23. If you would, that's Leviticus chapter 23. We'll begin right there in verse 1. That's Leviticus chapter 23. Now, while we're turning over there, if you would let me just read Genesis 1, verse 14 to you. And this is concerning God's appointed times. So this is Genesis 1:14. "And God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and to let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." The word seasons here is the Hebrew word 4150. It's a Hebrew moed, and it means an appointment with God. That is a fixed time, specifically a festival, by implication an assembly, as convened for a definite purpose. So the word season in Genesis 1:14 refers to an appointed time for us to meet with God. And for example, the moon determines the beginning of the month on God's calendar. When God specifies a day of the month as a holy day, that day is actually determined from the new moon. But of course, our modern calendars don't have our months beginning with any particular phase of the moon, let alone a new moon. Despite our modern calendar term month, which really comes from mooth, you might say, today the moon has absolutely no relationship to the beginning or ending of our months on our modern Gregorian calendar. Times have changed. But by using the lights in the firmament of the heavens, including the moon, God defines his annual holy days for his people. In addition to that, of course, every seventh day is a holy day as declared by God. That's a weekly Sabbath. God gave us instructions for the days we were to meet with him and the others around us that belong to him. Again, let's go to Leviticus 23, verse 1. And remember that as spiritual Israelites, these words are certainly for us. Leviticus 23, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say to them, Concerning the feasts of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. So here we go, verse 3. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Now here, God declares that we should work for 6 days, just as God did at creation. But like God's example on the seventh day of creation, the seventh day is to be a day of rest for us. No work is to be done. And we see it to be a holy convocation. In other words, a sacred assembly. A day for us to meet with God and each other. Now here, God declares that we should work for 6 days, just as God did at creation. But like God's example on the seventh day of creation, the seventh day is to be a day of rest for us, and no work is to be done. Now, which is the seventh day? People ask that question. Well, our calendars have changed over time in regard to the months and even the years, but the weeks have remained unchanged. Now, Sunday is the first day of the week. The seventh day of the week is what we call Saturday today. So then, the day we call Saturday is the Sabbath day, right? Well, that's not exactly true. According to God's calendar, days begin and end at sunset. Mark 1 verse 32 tells us, and at even, when the sun did set, well, it tells us that even is the time of day when the sun sets. We'll see very shortly that God's Sabbaths are to be observed from even until even, or in other words, from sunset to sunset. So hang on, we'll get right to that. But God's weekly Sabbath day, the only day of the week that God ever consecrated and made to be holy, set apart from all the other days of the week, it's from sundown Friday evening until sundown Saturday evening. Let's move on to briefly look at God's annual Sabbath days. These are in addition to the weekly Sabbath. Not like the weekly Sabbath day that always falls on the seventh day of the week, God's 7 annual holy days can fall on any day of the week, including falling on his weekly Sabbath days occasionally. Verse 4. These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations which you shall proclaim in their seasons or at their appointed times. So here are the annual Sabbath days of God, days we're instructed to meet, days that are to be sacred assemblies for us, per verse 4. Okay, the next verse, verse 5. In the 14th day of the first month at even, or going down to the sun, is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. In the first day, that's on the 15th, you shall have an holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. So the first annual holy day being spoken of here is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which lasts 7 days. Now this feast starts on the 15th day of the first month on God's calendar. And that means that on the 15th day of God's first month, we're to cease from our work and have a sacred assembly. It's a Sabbath. Now to most of us, that would mean going to church. But of course, it doesn't mean having to go to a specific building belonging to a certain church denomination. But it does mean that God's people are to assemble together to worship God and learn from His Word. The location isn't necessarily all that important, but the appointed time is. The date of our sacred assembly is specific. and given to us by God. Now, this is, of course, the first of God's 7 annual holy days. Now for the second, verse 8. Again, concerning the Feast of Unleavened Bread, verse 8. But you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord 7 days. In the seventh day, well, that's the last day of this 7-day feast, in the seventh day is a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. So this is the second annual holy day of the year, and it'll occur on the 21st day of the first month on God's calendar. It's the last day of God's 7-day festival that begins on the 15th day of the first month. The third annual Sabbath is Pentecost, also called the Feast of Weeks. Now, here we actually count 50 days after the Sabbath when the wave sheaf was offered to determine this holy day. It's the only one of God's holy days that does not fall on a specific date each year. We'll discuss this further in the future, of course, but let's drop down to verse 21 for now. Verse 21. You shall proclaim on the selfsame day that it may be a holy convocation to you, that you shall do no servile work therein. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. This is a day of celebration and worship, a time of rest from your work. You and your descendants must obey this law. Now, this is referring back to the other last Sabbath. It's also clear that we're to continue to observe these holy days throughout our generations. Both us and our children are to observe it. Okay, so verse 24, and here we'll see God's next holy day. Leviticus 23, verse 24. Speaking to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the first day of the month, shall you have a Sabbath, a memorial blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. The memorial blowing of trumpets is our 4th annual holy day defined by God. It's observed on the first day of the 7th month on God's calendar. Verse 27. Also, on the 10th day of the 7th month, there shall be a day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation to you, and you shall afflict your souls, and offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. You shall do no work in that same day, for it is a day of atonement, to make an atonement for you before the Lord your God. Now, this is, of course, God's day of atonement. Verse 32. It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and you shall afflict your souls. So we're actually to fast on this day, but again, that's for us to discuss at another time. But note the rest of this verse. The Sabbath begins the night before at sunset, when the 9th day of the month ends, and the 10th begins. And this Sabbath ends at sunset on the 10th, since that's when God's day ends. Continuing, let's look at that. In the 9th day of the month at even, or at sunset as we saw earlier, from even unto even, from sunset to sunset, shall you celebrate your Sabbath. So we see that God's Sabbaths are to be observed from sundown to sundown on the day he specifies, as was previously stated. For the last 2 annual holy days on God's calendar, the 2 we recently observed, verse 34. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. Like the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first day of the feast, in this case, the 15th day of the 7th month, there is an annual Sabbath day. Verse 36. 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. On the 8th day shall be a holy convocation to you, and you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. It is a solemn assembly, and you shall do no servile work therein. Now this 8th day, often called the last day or the last great day, is the last of the 7 annual holy days declared by God. It always occurs on the 22nd day of the 7th month on God's calendar. So there we have God's appointed times as God promised in Genesis chapter 1. God's appointed times were not an afterthought. They were spoken of in Genesis even before the creation of man. And God's holy days are not just for the Jews, but as we just read, for all Israelites. And if we're true followers of Jesus Christ, then we're heirs to the promise and spiritual Israelites. And these holy days, were created for us. Peter and the rest of the disciples in Jesus' day observed these days, just as God commanded. But today, well, times have changed. Our appointed times with God seem to have changed. But yet, God's appointed times have never changed. Jesus Christ never changes. Hebrews 13 verse 8 tells us that Jesus Christ, the same yesterday and today and forever. If we fail to meet with God on the days He sets an appointment for us, will He really be there on the days we appoint for Him? Are we following God, or do we expect Him to follow us? No, God doesn't change. His commandments never change. Today, murder is still wrong. It's still a sin, and it always will be. God's 10 commandments have never been done away with, and they never change. What God has called holy will always remain holy. What God calls sin will always remain sin. We as humans simply cannot take it upon ourselves to make something holy, nor can we decide what is sin and what is not. But this is why I believe Peter would likely not recognize modern Christianity today. Turn to Proverbs chapter 30, if you would, with me. It's Proverbs chapter 30, and we'll start in verse 5. That's Proverbs chapter 30, verse 5. Over time, man has done exactly what God warned us not to do. Traditional Christianity has decided that it knows better than God. Again, Proverbs 30, verse 5. I'll be reading this, by the way, in the Contemporary English Version. Here we go. Everything God says is true, and it's a shield for all who come to Him for safety. Don't change what God has said. He will correct you and show that you are a liar. Okay, let's turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 4, if you would. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. Let's look at a second witness here to make sure we got it right. Again, that's Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. And when we get there, we might note that we're to keep all of God's commandments as well. Again, Deuteronomy 4, verse 2. Here's what it says. You shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall you diminish aught from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you. And of course, we're familiar with Jesus in John 14, verse 15, where He says, if you love me, keep my commandments. In Revelation 12, verse 17, we're told that the remnants of the true church are those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. But getting back to Peter, if he hypothetically appeared today and walked into one of the typical Christian churches on God's Sabbath day, what would happen? Well, in most cases, he'd find nobody there. And Peter would likely have no idea why people have abandoned God's holy Sabbath day, the seventh day of the week, and now most of you meet on the first day of the week. He wouldn't understand that. He knows that God's appointed times have never changed. God never changed them. In fact, why would He? Did God make a mistake when He declared them in the first place? No, of course He didn't. No, it's man that changed God's appointed times, even though we just saw that God warned against this. But nevertheless, the weekly Sabbath was abandoned. It was removed. It was taken away, as were God's annual holy days as well. And Sunday became the new day of worship, a day that God never sanctified nor made holy. Man declared Sunday to be holy. What about the 7 annual holy days that God set aside for us? The ones we just read about in Leviticus 23. The ones that actually teach us about God's true plan of salvation. Well, they were removed completely and replaced, you might say, with holy days, although we might call them holidays, that came from men. Can man make things holy? Can man create a holy day and expect God to change to what man wants? As we said before, no. We're supposed to be following God, not expect our Creator to follow us. But then we have to realize that many of us have been deceived about God's Sabbath days. Many of our ancestors, indeed many of our friends, keep the first day of the week rather than the seventh. And they often try to get us to switch to Sunday because times have changed. And after all, what difference does it make? God doesn't care, most likely. Let's turn to Isaiah 58, verse 13. I feel that God does care. I'd like to talk about a person I've known that's been a very religious person, and one who does their very best to be a Christian. They really try hard at this, and I appreciate that. Now, many years ago, they treated Sunday just as God commanded us to keep a Sabbath. In fact, they believed that Sunday was the Sabbath, and they were following God's instructions the best they could. So they refused to work on that day, the first day of the week. I don't suppose that sounds all that bad. But as time went on, they began to recreate on the first day of the week, what they considered to be their Sabbath. They'd go to the church in the morning and then take their boat to the lake and then ski and fish the rest of the day. They had a lot of fun. So how's that sound? Again, Isaiah chapter 58, verse 3. Here's what we read. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. Now, on God's Sabbath day, we're not just to do our own thing. We're not to seek our own pleasure. Now, this is a day set aside to be with God and his people. If we do this and not make the day all about ourselves, what happens? What happens when we truly set aside time to focus on God on the day he asks us to do this? Let's see, verse 14. If we do that, then shall you delight yourself in the Lord. Or as many other translations put it, you shall find joy in the Lord. Continuing. And I will cause you to ride upon the high places of the earth and feed you with the heritage of Jacob my father, your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. But we're not to do our own pleasure on the Sabbath. But if we keep the Sabbath as God commands, we'll be blessed and find great joy in the Lord. But back to the person and their family that were keeping Sunday as their Sabbath, the day they believed was the Sabbath. Although they did their own pleasure on the Sabbath, this family would not work. They refused to work on the first day of the week, per the commandment. Their Sabbath, that was. In fact, they condemned others for doing so. They condemned others for working on that first day of the week. This went on for a long time. But one day, one of them told me that they had a new job. Knowing the nature of this job, I suspected that this new job would have them working every day of the week at some point. So I asked them about their schedule. Yes, it was true. They'd be working many weekends, both Saturdays and Sundays. So knowing that they had strongly opposed to working on the Sabbath, on their Sabbath anyway, I reminded them that they had not only refused to work on Sunday in the past, but warned others not to as well. How did they respond to that question? What do you think they said? And I quote, this is exactly what they said, I quote, well, times have changed. Times have changed. Well, they're right. First, the weekly day of worship was changed. Then the day became one of their own pleasure. Then they began to work on their Sabbath day. And eventually this led to withdrawing from the church altogether. But the same goes for God's annual holy days, by the way, of course. They were abandoned for what man thought would be better, I suppose. But that better is little more than pagan idolatry and worship disguised as Christianity. Not only do they lose out on the prophecy and the great promises contained in God's holy days, but they practice what God calls an abomination to him. They teach their children about Santa and the Easter Bunny, but rarely about Jesus Christ. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 11, if you would. That's Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 19. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 19. This may sound like a silly question, But do our Bibles instruct us to teach our children about Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny? Or do our Bibles warn us that we should pay attention and never be deceived, that we should never serve other gods and worship them? But of course, many Christian parents today teach their children to worship Santa and the Easter Bunny. Who brings them gifts, for example? Christ? Nope, not at all. Children are taught by their Christian parents to pray to Santa Claus for their wants and needs, sadly. What does God have to say about this? Again, Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 16. Take heed to yourselves that your heart be not deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them, which, of course, is what most of today's holidays are all about. But again, most Christians are deceived today. Verse 17. And then the Lord's wrath be kindled against you, and he shut up the heaven that there be no rain, so they would have a drought, and that the land yield not her fruit. Now, of course, that's famine. And famine would naturally follow a drought. But does that sound familiar to anyone? We're hearing a lot about drought in the news today. The worship of other gods and goddesses eventually has consequences, and they can be severe. Continuing in verse 17. Unless you perish quickly from off the good land which the Lord gave you. Therefore shall you lay up these my words in your heart, in your soul, and bind them for a sign unto your hand, upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes. We need to keep the words of God, not the words of men. You may recall in Acts 5, verse 29, Peter and the other apostles said, we ought to obey God rather than men. I agree with Peter. But verse 19, and you shall teach them, now that's God's words, not the words of those who worship false gods. These are God's words. And you shall teach them, your children, speaking of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. So how often should we teach our children about God's words and his commandments? Well, if we teach them when we sit in our house, when we walk by the way, when we lie down, and when we get up, well, that's practically all the time. But we're not to teach our children words that promote false gods or otherwise go against what God has said. Verse 20. And you shall write them upon the doorpost of your house and upon your gates, that your days may be multiplied, and the days of your children in the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers to give you, as the days of heaven upon the earth. So if Peter suddenly found himself in today's society, would he be teaching his children about Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny? Not to mention taking his children out trick-or-treating. Oh, I believe there's no way Peter would even consider doing these things. They would be so foreign to him. It would seem like a totally different religion. But what about church leadership today? Let's switch topics for a second. Numerous churches have split over the qualifications of their ministers lately. Now, some believe that ministers that continue to practice sexual immorality, as defined by the Bible, should not be ministers or leaders in the church. But the trend today is to accept what God has called an abomination to him. Now, understand, no one is perfect. No one is completely devoid of sin today. No one. None of our leaders, no one. But our leaders should not knowingly and willfully continue in any practice that God clearly identifies as sin. Yet, many churches back leaders that do that very thing. Times have changed. Christianity has changed. What would Peter think about the changes the typical Christian church has gone through the last 2,000 years? He probably wouldn't believe it. We received a phone call before this year's feast. We were asked if we had a dress code for our services. Well, to be honest, I hadn't given this a lot of thought. My first reaction was to say, well, no, we have no actual dress code. Of course, however, times have changed. And people no longer dress for church as they once did. Now, when I was around 8 years old, my mother dressed me in a white shirt and dress pants to go to church. She also had me wear a clip-on little bow tie. I remember that thing. Our church back then, most of the men wore dress clothes, including a jacket and a tie. Women wore their finest clothes. But again, times have really changed. It seems today that people wear just about anything and everything to church. But what should we wear when we attend our sacred assembly with God and His people? Well, it's certainly true that our dress today has certainly been trending to being more informal lately. Where I used to work, I was required to wear at least a sports jacket with a tie. The only exception was when the outside temperature was above 87 degrees. I think that was right, 87. At that point, we could take off our coat if we were outside. Now, later I worked for a company that introduced casual Fridays. Even still, this company had a dress code that stated what was acceptable on even casual days. For example, jeans in general were fine, but there were some versions of jeans that were not. I'm not familiar with these, but I forgot what they were called. But anyway, but it did seem that on these casual Fridays that production seemed to go down. People seemed to be less focused on their jobs they were doing. I believe that what we wear can actually affect us. What we wear actually in some ways communicates who we are and what our intentions are. How we dress often reflects our attitudes about what we're doing or the importance of what we're doing. Now, once I was invited by my company's president to attend an important conference with him. Actually, I was asked to speak about the technical aspects of our company, specifically our statewide network and how it was configured. Well, this was an important conference. It potentially had an impact on how our company was viewed and even on our future to some degree. Yeah, no pressure there, right? No big deal. Well, what did I wear to the event? No one told me what to wear. Well, I instinctively wore a suit. So why didn't I just finish painting my shutters and mow my yard in all the heat and then just jump in my car without cleaning up and head over to speak at this conference? Why didn't I do that? Well, for one thing, the conference began very early in the morning, so that took care of that. But my point is that speaking to an important audience like that in dirty, soiled clothes would not be appropriate. As it turned out, our president and practically all the men there were wearing suits. The women were also dressed very professionally. And we often dress according to the importance of what we're doing. So the question I might have for all of us is there anything more important than our sacred time, our appointed time with God? And I would say no. Therefore, should men, for example, always wear a suit and tie to church then? No, not necessarily. But should people show up with paint-covered, sweaty work clothes to church? No, absolutely not. That doesn't sound good at all. But meeting with God at His appointed times is something very special. People used to have a great awe for God, a great respect of our Creator. Today, maybe not so much. Years ago, you'd be hard-pressed to find a minister wearing casual clothes when he spoke. Today, it almost seems that ministers try to dress as sloppy and intentionally in bad taste as possible. That's what it appears to me. Is this the message they want to send to God and His people? Is this the example they want to set? That worshiping our Creator is a casual, relatively unimportant event? It seems to me that many of our church leaders today want to become more like the people of the world, rather than setting an example of what a person of God should be like. And that's reflected with their doing away with God's commandments, their lack of condemnation for sin, their acceptance of willful sin by leaders of the church. Many churches today rely on music and entertainment to attract members. You're not going to believe this, but earlier this week, we were watching television and we saw a minister dressed as Elvis and attempted to impersonate Elvis right in the middle of a church service. We seem to have lost our awe and our respect for God. And this is reflected in many of the church services we see today. I think Peter would be appalled at what he would witness today that many call a church service. But back to our church dress code. We really have no code as such. There's no such thing in our Bibles. Now, I really doubt that Jesus wore a three-piece suit when he spoke at the Sermon on the Mount. But we should be respectable. Women should not wear revealing, inappropriate clothes to a church service, or really any time, actually. All of us should be clean when we come to church and dress respectfully. But let me tell you a quick story to make sure that I'm not misunderstood. I attended a feast once where the pastor had someone recruit, for lack of a better word, recruit people at the feast to perform certain tasks, such as opening and closing prayers, taking up an offering, etc. Now, one of the people chosen to take up the offering was wearing a suit, but he had a bolo, or I call it a Western type tie, small little thing. It was not one of the more common long ties like I'm wearing today. Now, when the pastor noticed this, he immediately had this person replaced with someone wearing a regular tie. I don't know how you would have felt, but this really upset me. It isn't the actual clothes we wear, as long as we're dressed respectfully when we come before our Creator. So, how do we answer the question of our dress code for the feast this year? Well, the answer is very simple, actually. Please just dress respectfully. Exactly how each of us does this is up to us individually. We should always dress respectfully, recognizing the importance of our appointment with our Creator. To conclude today, times have changed. Technology makes our lives better today in many ways. But changes in our worship of God have not gotten better in general. In fact, they've generally gotten much worse. Most of modern Christianity today has abandoned God's holy days, the days He sanctified, set apart, and made holy. They do this in favor of man's idea of what holy days should be like, aided by Satan, of course. And in doing so, losing the value of God's great holy days and the great knowledge and the blessings they bring to all of us. First it seemed that we abandoned God's true holy days. Then we began doing our own pleasure on the days we replaced the Sabbath with. We began doing work on the Sabbath day. Began to become like any other day. For many Christian churches today, I don't believe Peter would even recognize them as churches of God. The respect and awe of God seem to be missing. It often seems more about entertainment or getting blessings from God despite our disobedience to His word. When we disobey God, when we do our own thing and ignore what He asks of us, what happens? Particularly in the minor prophets, as we've seen lately in our Bible studies, and as we saw today in Deuteronomy 11 and verse 17, we tend to see drought followed by famine. And we're seeing drought today. Will it be followed by famine? Well, God never changes, but people do. In fact, we should. We should change. But rather than change with the world, rather than abandon God's holy days and do what we think is right in our own eyes, we need to change to become more like Jesus Christ, to learn from His example. We need to go back to our Bibles and stop following those who would teach us to abandon the Word of God, that we should listen to men rather than God. In fact, if Peter was here today, I think he'd probably repeat what he said to that high priest. Again, we ought to obey God rather than men. Times have changed, but God hasn't. His truth hasn't changed. God's commandments have not changed. Sin has not changed. Jesus Christ never changes, but we should change. We should learn and grow closer to Christ. We should change, or it's called repent, right? We should change or repent as we learn that what we're doing currently is not actually pleasing to God. We need to prepare to become part of God's great kingdom. And there are blessings that come with our obedience to God. We know that. Great blessings. So let's continue to study the Word. Let's grow closer to God as we look forward to God's great kingdom when all will truly worship Him in spirit and in truth.